It began as a shared impulse, a reckless desire to leave the world behind and lose themselves in the wilderness. The five friends, Rachel, Sam, Elise, Mike, and Victor, had grown tired of the ceaseless hum of their lives in the city. A weekend in the dense forest of Blackwood Pines seemed like the perfect antidote. They had heard the stories, of course, whispers of strange disappearances and unsettling phenomena. But these were dismissed as mere folklore, campfire tales to thrill tourists. None of them believed in ghosts or curses. They believed in escape, and the forest promised that. Blackwood Pines greeted them with a silence so profound it bordered on unnatural. The trees stood tall and ancient, their gnarled trunks twisted as if frozen mid-dance. Their canopy was so thick that it blotted out much of the sun, leaving the forest floor cool and dim. Rachel was the first to notice the strange acoustics. "It's too quiet," she remarked, her voice startlingly loud in the stillness. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Sam, ever the skeptic, waved off her concerns. "It's just the wilderness. You're used to traffic and noise," he said with a dismissive chuckle. His bravado was infectious, and the group pressed on, their hiking boots crunching on the uneven trail. They were armed with maps, compasses, and an overabundance of snacks, confident they could handle whatever nature threw at them. But the forest had a way of swallowing confidence whole. An hour into their trek, the trail grew less distinct. Where once there had been a well-marked path, there was now a meandering stretch of dirt interspersed with roots and overgrown vegetation. Elise pulled out the map, squinting at it as if sheer willpower could make sense of their surroundings. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "We should have passed a stream by now." Mike shrugged. "Maybe we're just slow." But his voice lacked its usual lightheartedness, and he didn't meet her eyes. Victor, the quietest of the group, pointed ahead. "Let's keep moving. It's probably just around the bend." The others nodded, too eager to push forward to question the subtle unease that was beginning to creep into their thoughts. As they walked, Rachel noticed something strange. The trees seemed closer together, their branches interlocking like fingers clasped in prayer. She shook her head, dismissing the idea as her imagination playing tricks. Yet the further they went, the more the forest seemed to close in on them. The air grew heavier, tinged with the earthy scent of moss and decay. It felt as if they were being watched, though when Rachel turned to look behind her, there was nothing but shadows. "Do you hear that?" Elise asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" Victor replied, "That? I don't know. It's like a whisper." The group fell silent, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, faint and barely perceptible, came the sound Elise had described, a low, whispering murmur like wind filtering through hollow reeds. It wasn't constant, more like a breath that came and went, but it was enough to send a shiver down Rachel's spine. "It's just the wind," Sam said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Elise insisted. "It sounds like words, like someone is whispering." Victor stepped closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's probably just your imagination. Forests can be weird like that." But his eyes darted nervously to the trees, betraying his calm facade. The group pressed on, their laughter and conversation now subdued. As the day wore on, they found themselves deeper in the forest than they'd intended. The trail had vanished entirely, and they were navigating by instinct and the faint markings on their map. The whispers, though intermittent, followed them. Sometimes they were faint, other times louder, as if the forest were leaning in to hear their every word. By the time they decided to set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. They chose a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even the fading light of dusk struggled to penetrate. The group busied themselves pitching tents and lighting a fire, eager to dispel the growing sense of unease. As they sat around the fire, its flickering light casting eerie patterns on their faces, Victor spoke up. "Do you ever think about why forests like these get such a bad reputation?" Rachel glanced at him, her expression cautious. You mean the stories? Disappearances and hauntings. Yeah, people always talk about forests like they're alive, like they can think or feel. Well, this one feels alive, Elise muttered, hugging her knees to her chest. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled, and the whispers, the ever-present whispers, seemed to grow louder in the silence. Morning in the forest came with little relief. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into faint beams that barely illuminated their campsite. Rachel was the first to wake, drawn out of an uneasy sleep by a strange noise, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. She sat up, her breath visible in the cool morning air. The others stirred shortly after, each looking as restless as she felt. "We need to find our way back to the trail today," Sam announced, stretching and yawning as if the forest hadn't unsettled him at all. He seemed eager to reassert his confidence, though the bags under his eyes told a different story. The group packed up quickly, wanting to move while the daylight lasted. Elise studied the map as the others kicked dirt over the remains of the fire. "We should head east," she said, pointing to a faint marking that represented the trail they'd lost. "If we stick to this direction, we'll find it again," but the forest seemed to have other plans. As they walked, the landmarks Elise had expected to see, the crooked pine, the outcropping of moss-covered rocks, were nowhere to be found. Instead, the trees all began to look the same, their gnarled roots weaving an almost impenetrable web across the ground. "We've passed this tree already," Rachel said after an hour, stopping abruptly. She pointed to a distinct knot on a large oak. "No way," Victor replied, though he looked uncertain. "It's the same one," Rachel insisted. "Look at the roots. They twist the same way as before." Sam rolled his eyes. "It's just a tree. They all look alike in the middle of a forest." "No," Elise said softly, her voice trembling. "She's right. We're going in circles." A heavy silence fell over the group. Sam opened his mouth to argue but closed it again, unable to refute the unease etched into everyone's faces. Victor looked at Elise's map, but the lines and markings that had seemed so clear yesterday now felt meaningless, as if the forest itself had shifted during the night. Panic began to creep in like a slow-moving fog. "What if the stories are true?" Rachel whispered, almost to herself. "Stop," Sam snapped, his voice louder than intended. "We're just lost. That's all. It happens. We'll figure it out." But his words rang hollow, and everyone could feel the weight of their growing fear. The group pressed on, but the farther they walked, the more disoriented they became. East became west, north became south, and even the sun seemed to betray them. At one point, Elise stopped abruptly, clutching Victor's arm. "Listen," she said, her face pale. At first, they heard nothing but the rustling of leaves. Then it came again, the whispers. Louder this time, and unmistakably close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't their imagination. The sound was real, and it was moving. "We're being followed," Rachel breathed, her voice barely audible. Victor scanned the forest but saw nothing. "Let's keep moving. Don't stop, no matter what." As they walked, the whispers seemed to grow louder, forming words they couldn't quite understand. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of movement in their periphery, a shadow darting between the trees, a flash of pale light just out of reach. Each time they turned to look, there was nothing. By the time they stopped to rest, the group was on edge, their nerves fraying with every passing moment. Rachel sat on a fallen log, clutching her knees to her chest. "What if we can't get out?" "We will," Sam said, though his bravado had all but vanished. "We just need to stay calm." But calm was a distant memory. As they sat in silence, trying to regain their strength, Rachel noticed something horrifying. The path they had just taken, the narrow trail they had fought so hard to stay on, was gone. She stood, her legs trembling. "Where's the trail?" she asked, her voice cracking. The others turned, their faces pale as they saw what she meant. The forest behind them was seamless, a solid wall of trees and brush. There was no sign of where they had come from, no broken branches or footprints to mark their passage. It's like it closed behind us," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, the group fully understood the gravity of their situation. The forest wasn't just vast and confusing. It was alive, shifting and changing as if it had a mind of its own. And it didn't want them to leave. By mid-afternoon, the forest had transformed into an oppressive labyrinth. Every direction felt the same, and even the sun seemed to waver in the sky, offering no consistent sense of time. Elise clutched the map in her trembling hands, its once reliable markings now little more than taunts. The air itself felt heavier, thick with an unplaceable tension, as if the forest were holding its breath. Victor tried to break the silence. "We need a plan," he said, though his voice was thin, almost pleading. Rachel's sharp laugh startled everyone. "A plan? We've been walking in circles all day. What kind of plan fixes this?" "Keep it together, Rachel," Sam growled, but his own composure was cracking. His usual confidence had given way to irritation and thinly veiled fear. Elise stepped between them, raising her hands. "Enough! Fighting isn't going to help us." Her voice wavered, but it carried an edge of authority that silenced the group. "We need to keep moving. We have to find water, shelter, anything." They trudged onward, their steps growing heavier with each passing hour. Occasionally, the whispers returned, closer now, circling them like vultures. The sound wasn't constant, instead coming in bursts that felt deliberate, calculated. Each time they paused to listen, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to react. Rachel broke the uneasy silence. "What do you think they're saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who cares?" Sam snapped. "It's just the wind or... I don't know. Nothing." "It's not nothing," Rachel insisted. "I think they're laughing at us." The group stopped in their tracks. Elise glanced around nervously, her eyes darting between the shadows. "Don't say that." The laughter, if that's what it was, seemed to grow louder in response, as if mocking her plea. It echoed through the trees, a warped, hollow sound that didn't belong to anything human. Victor's flashlight flickered as the sun began to dip behind the treetops. "We need to find a place to stop for the night," he said. "It's getting dark." No one argued. The forest in daylight was terrifying enough. The thought of being caught in total darkness was unbearable. They stumbled upon a small clearing and decided to set up camp. Sam worked silently to build a fire, his hands shaking as he struck the flint. Elise unpacked what little food they had left, rationing it carefully. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees at the edge of the clearing loomed like sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The fire offered some comfort, its flickering light a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. It was Rachel who noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. The group froze, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then it came a low, rhythmic sound like something being dragged across the ground. It was distant, but growing closer. Sam grabbed a thick branch from the fire, holding it like a weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just dragging. It was accompanied by faint, guttural breaths. Something was moving toward them, slowly but deliberately. Victor aimed his flashlight toward the noise, the beam slicing through the darkness. At first, it revealed only trees and underbrush. But then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was hard to make out, a shadow against shadows, its form unnatural and wrong. It seemed to ripple as it moved, like smoke trapped in a solid shape. The breathing grew louder, now clearly coming from whatever lurked just beyond their sight. "Is it watching us?" Rachel whispered, clutching Elise's arm. "Don't look at it," Elise hissed, though she couldn't tear her own gaze away. The thing stopped moving, lingering just outside the firelight. For what felt like an eternity, the group sat frozen, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding. Then, without warning, the shadow withdrew, disappearing into the trees. What was that?" Victor stammered, lowering the flashlight. No one answered. The whispers returned, louder now, circling the clearing like a cruel chorus. The group huddled closer to the fire, their earlier squabbles forgotten in the face of a new, primal fear. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let them leave. By the time dawn approached, sleep had been a fleeting luxury for the group. The fire burned low, its embers pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of a dying thing. No one had dared to speak much after the shadows' retreat. And now, with the thin light of morning bleeding through the forest canopy, the events of the previous night felt almost surreal. Almost. I don't think it left, Victor murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. He sat cross-legged near the dying fire, flashlight clutched tightly in his hands. It's... Rachel asked bitterly, running her fingers through her tangled hair. What even is it, Victor? A bear? A demon? Some lunatic stalking us for kicks? Her voice rose with every word until Elise shot her a silencing glare. Whatever it is, Elise began, her voice steady but low, we can't just sit here and wait for it to come back. We need to move. Rachel scoffed but said nothing. Sam nodded in agreement, though the exhaustion etched into his face made his confidence feel hollow. They packed up quickly, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sending jolts of paranoia through the group. The forest felt different this morning, almost sentient. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks forming impenetrable walls that funneled the group forward, forcing them deeper. The map, now creased and smudged, offered no salvation. It was as if the forest had changed overnight, warping its geography to confuse and entrap them. Victor suddenly stopped in his tracks, holding up a hand. Do you hear that? They froze, listening intently. The whispers were back, but this time they carried a strange cadence, a rhythm like a chant. It was impossible to tell what direction they came from. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, surrounding them. Sam took a step forward, gripping his makeshift torch. It's trying to scare us, he muttered, as much to himself as to the others. It wants us to panic. Well, it's working, Rachel snapped. Then, the chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was deafening. It lasted for only a moment before being replaced by a new sound, a child's laughter. High-pitched, melodic, and entirely out of place, the sound sent chills down their spines. Is someone there? Elise called out, her voice trembling. No answer came, only more laughter, this time closer. Without warning, the bushes ahead of them parted, and a small figure emerged. It was a girl, no older than 7, wearing a tattered white dress stained with dirt and something darker. Her hair hung in limp, knotted strands around her face, obscuring her features. Oh my God, Rachel whispered, stepping back. What is she doing out here? Wait, Victor said sharply, grabbing Rachel's arm before she could move forward. Something's not right. The girl lifted her head slowly, revealing eyes that were a hollow, milky white. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach those empty eyes, and when she spoke, her voice echoed unnaturally. You don't belong here. No one moved. The forest seemed to close in around them, the air growing heavier with every second. Elise was the first to speak. Who are you? Are you lost? Her words were careful, but her tone betrayed her fear. The girl tilted her head as if confused, then laughed, a sound too loud and too distorted for her small frame. I've always been here. You're the ones who were lost. Before anyone could react, the girl stepped back into the shadows of the trees and vanished, leaving only the echo of her laughter behind. What the hell was that? Sam asked, his voice shaking. I don't know, Elise replied, clutching the map tightly. But we can't stay here. Let's go. As they pushed onward, the forest seemed to mock their every step. The laughter continued to haunt them, sometimes far away, sometimes so close it felt as though it were inside their own minds. And beneath it all, the whispers returned, their words just barely out of reach, a maddening symphony that refused to relent. For the first time, it truly dawned on them. The forest wasn't just alive. It was watching, and it wasn't letting them go. The forest had grown darker, an unnatural gloom descending over the group even as the morning sun should have filtered through the canopy. The whispers that had plagued them earlier had returned, louder now and almost forming words. The group pressed on, though each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very ground beneath them resisted their passage. Victor led the way, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight. Elise walked close behind, the map clutched tightly in her hands, though the lines and markings on it now seemed like meaningless scribbles. Sam followed her, his makeshift torch reduced to a charred stick, and Rachel brought up the rear, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. "We've been here before," Victor said suddenly, his voice strained. He pointed to a large, gnarled tree with an unmistakable scar across its trunk. "I'm sure of it. We're going in circles." "That's impossible," Elise argued, though her voice lacked conviction. "We've been heading in the same direction the whole time." Rachel snapped, her nerves frayed. "What if this isn't a normal forest? What if it's changing? Like shifting around us?" "Don't start with that," Sam muttered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. The group paused by the scarred tree, their exhaustion palpable. Victor crouched near its roots, tracing the lines of the scar with his fingers. "This isn't just a tree," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's marking something." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the forest, followed by a deafening crack as the earth split open near the tree's base. The group staggered back, staring in horror as a chasm yawned before them. "What the hell is happening?" Rachel screamed, clutching Sam's arm. From the depths of the chasm came a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a guttural roar that seemed to shake the air itself. Then, something began to emerge, a twisted, writhing mass of roots, each one blackened and oozing a thick, tar-like substance. The roots twisted together, forming what could only be described as a grotesque humanoid shape, its body hunched and its featureless head tilting toward the group. The creature moved, its root legs dragging it forward. The whispers that had haunted them now poured from it, a cacophony of overlapping voices that filled the air. "Leave this place," the voices intoned, their tone both commanding and pleading. Victor stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. What do you want from us?" he shouted. The creature paused, its head tilting again. When it spoke, its voice was singular, a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "You trespass on sacred ground. The forest has chosen." "Chosen what?" Elise demanded, though her voice cracked. The creature extended a root-like arm toward her, stopping just short of her chest. "One must stay. The rest may leave." The group froze, the weight of the statement crashing over them. Rachel's face twisted in disbelief. "What? No. No way. That's insane." Victor's voice was low, almost a growl. "It's lying. It's trying to divide us." But Elise wasn't so sure. She stared at the creature, its form both monstrous and strangely ancient, as though it had existed long before the forest itself. There was no malice in its tone, only a grim certainty. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Sam said firmly, stepping in front of Elise. "We'll find another way out." The creature's head tilted once more, as if studying them. Then, without another word, it began to sink back into the chasm, the earth closing over it as though it had never been there. The whispers faded, but the air remained heavy with unspoken tension. The group stood in stunned silence, each of them grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. Whatever the creature was, its message had been clear. The forest demanded a sacrifice, and the choice would have to be made, or they would all be trapped forever. The silence after the creature's departure was suffocating, like the weight of an invisible hand pressing down on each of them. No one spoke as they resumed walking, each step hesitant and directionless. The forest now seemed alive, its trees leaning closer together, their branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. Elise clutched the map, her fingers trembling. The lines on it had changed again, rearranging into nonsensical spirals. "This thing is useless," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, and crumpled the map in her fist. Victor, walking ahead, stopped abruptly. "So, what now? We can't just keep wandering." His voice carried a sharp edge, his frustration threatening to boil over. Maybe we should stop for a while, Rachel suggested. She glanced nervously at the ground, as though expecting the roots to rise again. Get our bearings. Rest. No, Sam snapped, his tone uncharacteristically harsh. We can't stay still. That thing said the forest is chosen. If we stop, it'll come back. Rachel's face twisted in anger. And what do you suggest? That we just walk until we drop dead? The tension between them was growing, an invisible crack forming in the group's fragile unity. Elise stepped between them, her voice shaky but firm. We have to stay together. That's the only way we get out of this. But even as she said it, the doubt was evident in her eyes. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a force pushing and pulling at them, testing the strength of their bonds. And it was winning. Victor turned to face the group, his expression grim. Maybe we need to face the fact that we're not all getting out of here. Rachel recoiled as though he had struck her. You can't seriously be suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Victor interrupted, his tone icy. I'm just saying that thing wasn't bluffing. If we don't make a decision, the forest might make it for us. Sam stepped forward, glaring at Victor. And you think you have the right to decide who stays? Is that it? I didn't say that. Victor snapped, but his defensive tone only added fuel to the fire. The argument spiraled, voices overlapping in a chaotic tangle. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every shouted accusation. Elise clamped her hands over her ears, her gaze darting wildly around the forest. Stop it! Stop fighting! Her plea went unheard, the argument continuing to escalate until the ground beneath them trembled once more. The whispers grew deafening, now sounding like mocking laughter. The trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing cry cut through the noise. Elise spun around to see Rachel on the ground, her leg tangled in a mass of roots that had snaked up from the earth. The roots were tightening, pulling her down inch by inch. "Help me!" Rachel screamed, clawing at the dirt. The group froze for a moment, paralyzed by shock. Then Sam lunged forward, grabbing Rachel's arms and pulling with all his strength. The roots resisted, their movements almost serpentine as they coiled tighter. "Don't just stand there. Help me!" Sam shouted at Victor and Elise. Victor hesitated, his gaze darting between Rachel and the forest around them. Elise, however, didn't wait. She dropped to her knees and began clawing at the roots, her nails breaking as she tried to tear them apart. The roots finally released Rachel with a violent snap, sending all three of them tumbling backward. Rachel sobbed, clutching her leg, which was streaked with dark welts where the roots had constricted her. The group sat in stunned silence, the only sound Rachel's ragged breathing. The whispers had faded again, leaving an oppressive stillness in their wake. Victor broke the silence, his voice low and unsteady. "This is what I'm talking about. The forest is forcing our hand. If we don't act, it's going to pick us off one by one." No one responded. They were all thinking the same thing, but too afraid to say it aloud. The forest wouldn't let them leave unless it got what it wanted. And it was only a matter of time before it demanded payment again. The air in the forest grew heavier with each passing moment, laden with an ominous stillness that wrapped around the group like a shroud. Rachel limped along, supported by Sam, her legs still throbbing from the roots' crushing grip. Elise walked ahead, clutching her torn nails against her chest, her mind racing with fractured thoughts of the creature's words and Victor's grim pragmatism. No one spoke for a while, the unspoken tension simmering between them like an unlit fuse. The forest seemed to sense it, its oppressive presence feeding off their fear. Even the birds, once faintly audible in the distance, had gone silent. It was Elise who stopped first, her eyes fixed on a tree directly ahead of them. The trunk was smooth and pale, standing out starkly against the dark bark of the surrounding forest. A strange, black mark had been carved into it, an elaborate symbol that spiraled inward like a labyrinth. "Do you see that?" Elise whispered, her voice trembling. Victor stepped closer to the tree, squinting at the mark. He ran his fingers over it, then quickly pulled them back as though it had burned him. "It's warm," he muttered, his voice laced with unease. "What does it mean?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse as she leaned on Sam. "It's a sigil," Elise said, her voice barely audible. She didn't know how she knew, but the word came to her with unnerving certainty. "It's a warning, or maybe a promise." Sam frowned, keeping his distance from the marked tree. "A promise of what?" Victor turned sharply toward him, his expression grim. "Nothing good, that's for sure." The sigil seemed to pulse faintly as they stood there, almost as though it were alive. Elise couldn't look away from it, the swirling pattern drawing her in like a whirlpool. Her breathing quickened as a sudden, vivid image flashed in her mind. A dark, writhing figure standing in a circle of trees, its eyes glowing like embers. She staggered backward, breaking free from the sigil's grip on her mind. "We need to leave," she said urgently, her voice cracking. Rachel scoffed bitterly. "And go where?" "It's not like the forest is giving us any choices." But Elise was already moving, pushing past the others and heading deeper into the trees. She didn't know where she was going, only that the sigil had awakened something within her, a fragment of knowledge buried deep in her subconscious. The others reluctantly followed, the forest seeming to close in around them as they moved. The sigil tree disappeared from view, but its memory lingered like a phantom. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Victor asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. "No," Elise admitted, her voice firm despite her fear. "But I know we can't stay here. That mark, it's a part of this forest game. If we stay, we're playing into its hands." Victor didn't argue, though his clenched jaw suggested he wanted to. Sam and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, their weariness outweighing their doubts. As they walked, the trees seemed to grow closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, forcing them to slow their pace. Elise glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening as she noticed something strange. The sigil tree was back, standing directly in their path. "That's impossible," she breathed, her voice trembling. "We left it behind." Victor's face paled as he stared at the tree. "It's following us." Sam shook his head in disbelief. "Trees don't move, not in a normal forest," Rachel muttered darkly, her voice barely audible. Elise stepped forward, her gaze locked on the sigil. "It's not the forest that's moving. It's us. It's keeping us in its grip, pulling us back to where it wants us." The realization settled over them like a cold mist. They weren't just lost. They were trapped in a shifting labyrinth, a game they had no hope of winning. The sigil pulsed faintly again, a quiet yet insistent reminder that the forest was watching, waiting, and hungering. Elise couldn't shake the feeling of the sigil's pull, even after they had turned away and forced themselves deeper into the forest. The air seemed thicker now, the scent of damp earth mingling with an acrid, metallic tang. Each breath felt labored, as though the forest was pressing against their lungs, demanding a toll. Rachel stumbled again, groaning in pain as Sam tightened his grip to steady her. "We can't keep going like this," she muttered. "I need to stop." Victor looked around, his jaw set in frustration. "Fine, but not here. We need to find somewhere safer." Elise turned to him, her face pale but resolute. "There's no such thing as safe in this place." Still, they trudged forward, the oppressive silence broken only by their labored breathing and the occasional snap of twigs beneath their feet. It wasn't long before the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing bathed in pale, silvery light. The group paused at the edge, unsure of whether to step into the open. The clearing was oddly symmetrical, its grass unnaturally uniform and unervingly lush compared to the twisted roots and brambles they'd been navigating. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, its surface etched with symbols similar to the sigil on the tree. "Is this better or worse than staying in the forest?" Sam asked, his voice heavy with sarcasm, but tinged with genuine fear. Elise stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. "It's something," she said softly, her tone distant. "We should look closer." Victor frowned, but didn't stop her. "If it's another trap, we'll know soon enough." Elise approached the altar cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate. The air felt colder as she drew nearer, a chill that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the surface, and froze as a faint whisper broke the silence. It wasn't a single voice, but a cacophony, overlapping murmurs that ebbed and flowed like the rustle of leaves. Elise jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others hesitated, their expressions uneasy. "I don't hear anything," Sam said, though his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. Victor approached, his face set in a mask of grim determination. "What did it say?" I don't know," Elise admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't clear. Just fragments." Rachel, leaning heavily on Sam, scowled. "If this thing is as bad as the sigil tree, why are we still here?" Before anyone could respond, the whispering grew louder, the indistinct murmurs sharpening into discernible words. "The offering. The price must be paid." The voice was neither male nor female, its tone hollow and ancient, carrying a weight that made Elise's knees buckle. She staggered back from the altar, clutching her chest as though the words had physically struck her. "What offering?" Sam demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What price?" The whispering didn't answer. Instead, the clearing grew colder, frost spreading across the grass in a jagged web. The altar pulsed faintly, its symbols glowing with a sickly green light. Victor pulled Elise back, his grip firm. "We're leaving," he said, his voice hard. "Now." But as they turned to retreat, the trees at the clearing's edge shifted, their trunks twisting and weaving together to form an impenetrable wall. The group froze, trapped, as the forest closed in around them. The whispering surged, a tidal wave of sound that filled their ears and minds. The price must be paid. Elise's eyes widened as a terrible realization dawned on her. The forest wasn't asking for something, it was demanding someone. The clearing pulsed with an eerie rhythm, as if it were alive, breathing in tandem with the whispers that echoed in the air. Frost crept up the trunks of the surrounding trees, turning them into spectral sentinels, their gnarled branches frozen in time. The group stood in a tight cluster, their faces pale with terror, each of them feeling the forest's intent closing in. "It's not letting us leave," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted to the glowing altar, then back to the others. "What does it mean? A price for what?" Victor tightened his grip on Elise's arm, pulling her closer. "We don't need to figure it out. We just need to get out of here." Elise shook her head, her voice trembling. "It won't let us. The forest, it's not just alive. It's aware." She gestured to the altar. "That thing, it's not asking. It's choosing." Sam, who had been pacing at the edge of the clearing, suddenly turned to face them. "This is insane. We're being trapped by a bunch of trees." He laughed bitterly, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. "No, there has to be a way out. This can't be real." As if in response, the whispering grew louder, drowning out his voice. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the symbols on the altar flared brighter. The forest wasn't merely sentient, it was angry. Elise dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the whispers seemed to pierce her skull. Flashes of images flooded her mind. A shadowy figure standing before the altar, a dagger dripping with blood, the forest's hunger appeased. She gasped, looking up at the others with wide, tear-filled eyes. "It wants a sacrifice." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, no one moved, their breath shallow as they tried to process what Elise had just said. "A sacrifice?" Rachel asked weakly, her voice shaking. "You mean one of us?" "No," Victor said sharply, stepping forward as if to shield the group from the unseen force. "We're not playing by its rules." But the forest was done waiting. The frost spread faster, creeping up their boots and anchoring them to the ground. The altar's glow intensified, casting the clearing in a sickly green light. The whispers coalesced into a single, commanding voice. "The blood will free you." Sam snapped, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. "This is crazy. We're not just going to stand here and..." His voice broke off as he yanked his foot free from the frost, stumbling toward the altar. Sam, no! Elise screamed, but he didn't stop. In a frenzy, Sam grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the altar. The stone struck the glowing surface, but instead of shattering, the altar absorbed the impact, the glow flaring brighter in response. A deep, guttural groan rippled through the clearing, shaking the ground and knocking Sam off his feet. The frost released him, but it crept higher on the others, binding them tighter. Elise sobbed as she struggled against the icy grip. Sam, stop. You're making it worse. Victor glared at the altar, his jaw clenched. If it wants someone, it's not going to get us without a fight. He pulled out a pocket knife, his hands trembling but determined. Whatever this thing is, it's not invincible. But Elise shook her head frantically. You don't understand. It's not about fighting it. It's about feeding it. Her voice broke, the desperation clear. It's going to keep us here until it gets what it wants. The whispers returned, their tone mocking, almost amused. The blood will free you. Choose. Victor looked around at the group, his resolve faltering as the reality of their situation set in. The clearing wasn't just a trap, it was a crucible, and the forest had made its intentions clear. One of them would have to die. No one spoke. The weight of the decision bore down on them, and the clearing seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The air was thick with dread, the oppressive silence following the forest's chilling demand. They were trapped, bound not just by the frost creeping up their legs, but by the realization of what they had to face. One of them had to die. The weight of the decision pressed down on each of them, the altar at the center of the clearing a stark reminder of the price the forest demanded. Sam's eyes were wide with disbelief, his voice shaky as he muttered, "This can't be real. It's not real." His hands shook as he reached down to pull his foot free from the frost, but the ice had already reached his knees. He yanked harder, but it was no use. The forest had its hold on him. The freezing grip only tightened. Victor stood motionless, his breath shallow, though his mind raced. He was no stranger to survival, but this was something beyond any wild animal or hostile terrain. The forest was a living thing, and it was far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. The whispers still echoed in his ears, each word a dagger of fear. The blood will free you. Choose. Elise, still kneeling at the edge of the altar, was trembling. She knew they couldn't outrun what was coming. The frost was only growing stronger, seeping into their clothes, numbing their bodies. And yet, as terrified as she was, a part of her understood that if they didn't act quickly, if they didn't make a choice, the forest would claim them all. There was no escape without sacrifice. Sam, stop, she cried again, but her voice was weak and hollow, drowned by the whispers. The frost clung to her like a vice, and the words seemed to invade her mind with each passing second, filling her thoughts with an undeniable sense of urgency. We have to do something. We can't wait forever. Rachel, her face pale and eyes wide with horror, looked around frantically. It wants blood. It doesn't care who. Any of us could be the sacrifice. Her voice wavered, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had already come to terms with the fact that one of them wouldn't make it out alive. Victor's gaze moved from Rachel to the altar, then back to the others. His grip on his knife tightened. If one of us is going to die, I'd rather it be me than anyone else. The words hung in the air for a moment, and a collective shudder passed through the group. They had all thought it, but none had said it aloud until now. Victor was willing to give his life to free them from this nightmare. But was that the right choice? That's not how this works, Elise whispered, her voice breaking. She stood up, her eyes locked on Victor's. If it's just blood, then it doesn't matter who. It just wants us to give it a life. We could lose any one of us, and it might not even free us. We're not bargaining with a person. We're bargaining with the forest itself. Rachel stepped forward, her face hardening. Then let's make a choice. It's us or it. We have to stop running. Her voice was filled with resolve, but there was an undercurrent of fear in her eyes. She was ready to fight for her life, even if it meant condemning someone else. The clearing seemed to grow colder, the whispers rising in volume as the tension thickened. Choose. The voice, ancient and all-consuming, rang out louder than ever. vibrating through their bones. It was clear now. The forest would take what it wanted, one way or another. Elise closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't want to be the one to make this decision, but she knew there was no avoiding it anymore. They couldn't stay in this hellish place, frozen by indecision. "We have to do something," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "If one of us has to die, let it be me." Victor shook his head vehemently. "No, it should be me. I'm the one who—" But Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp and final. "Enough. It doesn't matter. The longer we wait, the worse it will get. We make our decision now, or the forest will choose for us." There was no further argument. The frost continued its relentless march upward, covering their torsos, their arms, threatening to lock them into place. A decision had to be made. Elise took a deep breath, steeling herself for what had to be done. She turned to face the altar, her heart heavy with the weight of their shared fate. The forest was right. One of them had to give their life, but not for the forest, for each other. They couldn't all survive this. Not unless they chose, willingly or not, to pay the price. The moment stretched on, stretching the boundaries of their sanity. The whispers ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Elise made her choice. Elise's decision was not made in a moment of bravery or rational thought. It was born from sheer desperation, the unbearable weight of the forest's demand, the pull of its malicious intent. She had chosen to sacrifice herself, not because she believed it would save them, but because she could no longer bear the suffocating dread that gripped every moment. She had become the forest's pawn long before the whispers called to them. The others stood in stunned silence, unable to speak. The air felt thick and heavy as Elise moved toward the altar, the ground beneath her feet no longer cold but burning, as if the very earth was alive, feeding on her resolve. Her heart hammered in her chest, the echoes of her own thoughts drowned by the eerie silence that surrounded them. She had made her choice, but now she faced the unknown consequences. "Stop, Elise! Don't do this!" Sam's voice was hoarse, raw from his own fear and panic, but it was too late. The frost that had been creeping up her legs had stopped its progress, as if the forest were holding its breath in anticipation. For a moment, there was stillness, a fleeting second where the world seemed to pause, waiting for the next move. But Elise kept walking, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. She reached the altar, her hands trembling as she stood before the glowing symbols. The whispers returned, now more insistent, the tone shifting from demand to something akin to satisfaction. "The blood is offered. The choice is made." The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't feel like her thoughts. They were foreign, alien, as though the forest had claimed her consciousness. She raised her hand, the knife she had taken from Victor now cold in her grasp. She knew what she had to do. It was the only way. Victor, still standing at the edge of the clearing, his hands clenched into fists, could only watch. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was nothing he could do. He knew that the forest's power was beyond them, that it didn't care about the individual. It only wanted the blood that would feed its hunger and perhaps release them from its clutches or condemn them forever. Elise's vision blurred as she stared at the knife. It was just a tool, an instrument of sacrifice. The blood wasn't hers. It never truly belonged to her. It belonged to the forest, to the ancient force that had claimed her long before she ever stepped into the clearing. She couldn't see the others anymore, their faces blurred behind the overwhelming presence of the altar, the pulsating energy in the ground beneath her feet. The knife slid across her skin effortlessly, a sharp, searing pain that tore through her consciousness. Her breath caught in her throat as the warmth of her blood poured over her hand, staining the blade. She felt a sudden, terrible clarity in that moment, as though she were becoming one with the forest itself. The world seemed to bend, the trees groaning in approval, their branches swaying like a chorus of whispers. Victor's voice was distant, like an echo from another world. "Elise!" he cried, his voice full of sorrow and frustration. But it was too late. Her sacrifice had already begun. The knife was a conduit, and the forest was already drinking her essence. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and for a split second, Elise felt as if the forest itself were shifting around her, the trees warping and stretching like dark fingers reaching into the very fabric of reality. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed forward, the knife falling from her grasp, the blood now pooling around the base of the altar. The forest hummed, its energy crackling through the air. For a moment, it seemed as if the world was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the frost receded, the grip that had been suffocating them loosening, just enough to allow the others to move. The forest was satisfied, for now. Elise's sacrifice had done its work, but the cost of freedom was not as simple as it seemed. Victor rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he touched her cold skin, searching for any sign of life. He could feel the remnants of her energy lingering in the air, but she was beyond reach. The blood had been taken, her essence consumed by the forest. The others gathered around, their eyes wide with horror, but there was no time for grief. Elise's sacrifice had opened the door, but it was unclear whether it had truly set them free. Rachel fell to her knees beside Victor, her face pale. "She's gone. She's really gone." Sam stood frozen, staring at the altar, the realization slowly settling over him. "We're not free, are we?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of truth. "No," Victor said, his voice tight with grief. He stood, helping Rachel to her feet, his eyes locked on the altar. "We're not free. Not yet." The forest had been appeased. But at what cost? The blood had been offered, but the price of freedom was never as simple as it seemed. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the whispers fading into the distance. It was as though the forest were waiting for something more, a final reckoning. As they turned to leave, the trees seemed to watch them, their ancient eyes following their every movement. There was no escape. Not yet. Not until the forest had had its fill. The silence after Elise's sacrifice was unnerving, thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on their shoulders. The group stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The frost had receded, but the air had not warmed. It was as if the temperature had become an extension of the forest itself. Cold, unyielding, and endlessly patient. Elise's blood, now absorbed into the earth, still seemed to linger in the atmosphere, a reminder of the price they had paid. Victor stood over her, his hands trembling as he brushed her cold hair from her face. He had known the forest was cruel, but he never imagined the cost would be so final. Elise had given her life to them, to their survival, but it seemed the forest's hunger was far from sated. It was only biding its time, waiting for something more. The frost might have receded for now, but they had not escaped. They never truly could. Rachel's voice broke the silence. "What now? What do we do?" Her words were soft, tinged with fear, but there was a thread of defiance woven through them. She had always been the strong one, the practical one, but now, in the face of this, she was lost. Elise's blood had not saved them. It had merely stalled their inevitable fate. "We keep moving," Victor said, his voice a low rasp. He straightened, his eyes scanning the dark trees that surrounded them. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting, bending, as if it were breathing. "We find a way out. We can't stay here. Not with whatever this is still hunting us." Sam had been quiet, his eyes cast downward, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The weight of Elise's death hung over him like a shroud, and the guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He had never believed they would make it out of the forest alive, but he had never truly believed it would cost them so dearly. Elise was gone, and nothing could bring her back. But now, the question that lingered in his mind was, why had the forest chosen her? Why not one of them? Victor's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the clearing. There was something different in the air now, something he couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the oppressive cold that had returned. It was the feeling that they were being watched. The trees, once motionless, now seemed to lean closer to them, their branches heavy with the weight of some unseen presence. "Do you feel that?" Victor asked, his voice low and cautious. Rachel stiffened, her gaze shifting nervously toward the trees. "What? I don't." "The eyes," Victor said, his throat dry. "They're watching us?" At first, Rachel thought he was being paranoid, but then she felt it too, an undeniable sense of being observed. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, and it was now studying their every move, waiting for them to make their next mistake. The trees seemed to pulse with life, the leaves rustling softly, but there was no wind. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. "Let's go," Sam said, his voice urgent, almost desperate. "We can't stand here. We can't keep waiting." He was already moving, his feet carrying him away from the altar and toward the path that lay beyond the clearing. But even as he spoke, his every step felt wrong, as though the earth itself were urging him to stop, to turn around, to give in. Victor followed, but his instincts were screaming at him to stop, to listen to the silence that had returned to the forest. But what would they find if they did? Was the silence a trap, or a temporary lull before something even worse descended upon them? They walked in tense silence, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to set. Each step felt heavier than the last, each one taking them deeper into the unknown, deeper into the heart of the forest. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger with each passing moment. The trees that surrounded them seemed to close in, the space narrowing as if the forest were enclosing around them. The forest had no mercy, and neither did time. As the darkness began to fall, the air grew colder again, a biting chill that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that made you question whether you were truly alive or simply existing in the forest's eternal shadow. "Where's the path?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, as if it had no beginning and no end. The trees were indistinguishable, their gnarled limbs twisting into shapes that felt vaguely human, but not quite. "I don't know," Victor admitted, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. "But we have to keep moving. We can't let it close in on us." The tension in his voice was palpable, and Rachel could feel the panic rising in her chest. She had seen fear before, but this was different. This wasn't just fear of what might happen. It was fear of what was already happening. And as they walked, the feeling of being watched became undeniable. The forest was alive, and it was waiting for them to make the next move. Every rustle, every creak of a branch seemed to hold a hidden meaning, a warning that they were not alone. The eyes were there, just beyond their reach, just out of sight. They weren't free. The forest had its grip on them, and no matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they tried to escape, the forest was always watching, always waiting. The oppressive silence of the forest grew unbearable as night fully descended. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift with the faint light from the moon. But no matter how much Victor tried to focus on the path ahead, it felt as though the darkness was consuming everything around them. The trees, gnarled and twisted, had taken on a more sinister form in the night, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal hands reaching down from some higher plane. Rachel shivered, not from the cold, but from something more primal, a sense that the forest was alive in ways they could not understand. Every footstep they took felt like a trespass, as if they were intruders in a world far older and more dangerous than they could comprehend. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had intensified, and the eyes, those invisible lurking eyes, seemed to be drawing closer with every passing minute. Victor's pace quickened, his nerves fraying. He needed to keep moving, to keep ahead of the terror that clawed at him from behind. But where was the path? He couldn't remember. The trees had grown thicker, denser, and the trail he had thought would lead them to safety seemed to have vanished into the dark thicket. Was the forest playing tricks on them? Or had they been walking in circles, hopelessly lost? Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop. "Victor, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice strained with a mix of fear and confusion. Victor stopped in his tracks, his body rigid as he strained to listen. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant creaking of branches. Then, slowly, like a whisper growing louder, there came the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, hollow echo that reverberated through the trees, growing in volume as though the forest itself were speaking. It was not a voice they could understand, but a deep, primal rumble, like a murmur from the earth itself. "What is that?" Sam's voice cracked, his wide eyes flicking nervously around them. He seemed to be shrinking under the weight of the sound, his shoulders hunched, as if trying to shield himself from the unseen threat that was closing in on them. Victor's mind raced. The sound wasn't natural. Nothing about this forest was. The echo had a rhythm to it, a pulse that seemed to come from beneath the ground, as though something was calling them, beckoning them deeper into the woods. He didn't want to believe it, but the hollow echo reminded him of the stories he had heard as a child, of ancient forests where the trees were alive, where the land itself was sentient, manipulating those who dared to venture too far. "Whatever it is, we need to move," Victor said, his voice low and firm. But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow, as though he were only trying to convince himself. He had always prided himself on his practical mindset, but here, in the heart of the forest, reason was losing its hold. Something ancient and malevolent was at work, and he wasn't sure he could protect them from it. The echo grew louder still, now almost deafening. It was like the sound of a giant heartbeat, pulsing in time with the blood rushing in their ears. It was as if the forest itself were alive, breathing in rhythm with them, its dark depths waiting for them to make their fatal mistake. "What is that?" Rachel whispered again, more to herself than to anyone else. Before Victor could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. It was a subtle shift at first, barely noticeable, but then the earth shook again, more violently this time. The trees groaned, their branches swaying as though some unseen force were pushing against them. The rumbling grew louder, now accompanied by the creaking of ancient wood. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a silhouette, a dark shape barely visible in the fog that had begun to creep in. But as it moved closer, it became clear. It was a person, a woman. Her face was obscured, hidden beneath a thick veil of hair that hung like tendrils, matted and wild. Her clothes were torn, shredded as though she had been dragged through the underbrush. She moved with an unnatural fluidity, her steps eerily silent despite the trembling earth beneath her. Victor took a step back, his heart pounding. This wasn't a person, it couldn't be. She was too still, too unnerving. The hollow echo grew louder still as she stepped forward, her eyes, though hidden beneath the veil, fixed on them, cold and unblinking. The woman stopped just in front of them, her presence suffocating. The very air seemed to thicken, as if the forest had drawn itself closer, tightening its grip. She didn't speak, but her movements were deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her hand reached out slowly, almost lazily, as if beckoning them to follow. Victor's mind raced. Was this a trap? Were they meant to follow her, led deeper into the forest where something far worse awaited? The hollow echo, the trembling earth, the unnatural stillness. It was all part of the forest's game, a game with rules they could never understand. "Stay close," he whispered to Rachel, his voice barely audible over the noise in his head. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let themselves be led astray. Not now. Not when they were so close to the edge of the unknown. The woman's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, the ground beneath them shifted again, more violently this time. And from the darkness, they could hear a low growl, a sound so deep, so primal, it shook them to their very core. The forest was closing in, and it wasn't going to let them leave. Not without paying the price. In the distance, the hollow echo came again, louder than ever, a signal of something far older and darker than they could possibly imagine. The woman's eyes flicked toward it, and then back to them, as though urging them to move forward. But the truth was clear. There was no escape. The forest had already claimed them. As the woman's hand hovered just inches from Victor's, the air around them seemed to warp, shimmering like heat rising from the pavement. For a moment, he felt as though he were standing at the edge of something vast, something beyond the forest, beyond the trees. The sensation was strange, as if the world he knew was beginning to slip away, replaced by something unrecognizable. A world where the rules no longer made sense. Time seemed to stretch and fold on itself, like the layers of reality were blurring and mixing together, forming a chaotic whirlpool. Rachel stepped closer to Victor, her breath quick and shallow, her gaze fixed on the woman before them. Her face, now more visible in the dim light, was expressionless, her features sharp and cold, almost alien. But there was something in her eyes, a dark, knowing emptiness, that sent a chill racing down Rachel's spine. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the sinking feeling that something within them had already been marked, that they were too far gone to simply walk away from this nightmare. Victor tried to shake the creeping dread that had settled over him, but the forest wouldn't let go. It was like the ground beneath their feet had become a living thing, pulling them deeper into the heart of the woods. Every time they tried to move, the trees seemed to stretch outward, blocking their way, as though the forest was shaping itself to keep them trapped within it. Every direction they turned led them to more darkness, more twisted paths that bent and curved back in on themselves. The woman didn't speak. She didn't need to. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned and began walking deeper into the woods, her footsteps soft, almost inaudible. Without hesitation, she beckoned them to follow. The hollow echo from before had grown quieter now, but there was something more chilling in the way it lingered, an insistent presence, like a low hum beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for them to make their move. Reluctantly, Victor and the others followed. They had no other choice. If they stayed, they would be consumed by the growing terror, swallowed by the unseen forces that haunted the forest. But if they followed her, what would they find? What awaited them in the depths of the woods? There were no answers to these questions. Only the oppressive pull of the woman's silent invitation and the sense that whatever they encountered next, it would be a trial. The forest wasn't going to let them escape. The trees grew closer together, their twisted forms looming overhead like dark, skeletal hands. The mist had thickened now, curling around their ankles like tendrils, seeping into their shoes and dampening the air around them. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a living, breathing thing, its pulse sinking with the echo beneath the earth. It seemed to be closing in on them, suffocating them with its oppressive weight. "I don't like this," Sam muttered, his voice trembling. This place feels wrong. I can't explain it." Victor's throat tightened, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. He felt the same way. The more they ventured into the heart of the forest, the more the air felt thick and heavy, as though they were descending into some ancient, forgotten place that had been sealed away for a reason. The deeper they went, the more disconnected they became from everything they knew. The world outside the forest seemed to have faded away entirely, leaving only the unrelenting presence of the trees and the darkness. Suddenly, Rachel froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice low, as though afraid to disturb whatever had drawn her attention. Victor followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. Ahead of them, the woman had stopped, standing before a large rock formation that jutted out from the forest floor like a monument. The rock was unlike any natural feature they had seen before, its surface smooth and unnatural, carved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. It was as if the stone had been shaped by hands that no longer existed, covered in markings that hinted at something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. This is impossible," Rachel murmured. "How could this be here? It doesn't fit with the rest of the forest." Victor felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a natural occurrence. The rock, the markings, it was all part of something much larger. Something had intentionally placed this here, guiding them toward it like pieces in a game that they didn't understand. The woman, standing perfectly still before the stone, appeared almost at one with the eerie surroundings. Her presence, now that they were so close, felt like an extension of the forest itself. The echo, which had faded for a moment, returned again with a low, resonant hum, vibrating through their bones. It was more pronounced now, as if the rock was somehow amplifying it. For a moment, Victor felt a surge of panic, a deep, gut-wrenching fear, as if something was coming, something that they couldn't escape. But as he looked at the stone, he noticed something different, something new. The symbols on the rock were shifting, changing before his very eyes, as if they were alive. The lines twisted and writhed, expanding and contracting, almost as if they were breathing. And then, just as quickly, the markings seemed to settle, forming a coherent pattern, a shape, a face. It was the faintest trace at first, but it became clearer with each passing second. It was the face of the woman, the one standing before them. But it wasn't her. It was something older, something deeper. The face on the rock was ancient, carved into the stone with a reverence that hinted at something worshipped, something feared. The woman's lips moved, though no sound escaped her. But they all felt the words, felt them in their bones. "Welcome," she seemed to say, though the word didn't pass her lips. The sensation was in their minds, the message clear and direct, reverberating in the stillness around them. It was an invitation, but not one they could refuse. Not anymore. As the words echoed in their minds, Victor realized with growing horror that this was no ordinary forest, no ordinary place. The veil of illusion was lifting, revealing something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The forest was alive, yes, but it was more than that. It was aware. It had been waiting for them. And now that they were here, they were bound to it. They were part of the game, whether they liked it or not. The forest wasn't just a place of terror. It was a place of sacrifice. The silence that followed the woman's cryptic words was thick, almost suffocating. Victor, Rachel, Sam, and the rest of the group stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The stone in front of them, an ancient monolith covered in strange markings, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The face that had appeared on its surface now lingered, etched deep into their memories. It wasn't just an image. It was a presence, a force, something that seemed to watch them with a knowing gaze that sent chills down their spines. Victor felt his heart pound in his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman. She hadn't moved since the words had echoed in their minds. Her form as still as the surrounding trees, her expression unreadable. In that moment, Victor realized something crucial. She wasn't just guiding them. She was part of this place, this forest, this ritual. It all centered around her. She was the key, and they were just pawns in a much larger game. Rachel's voice broke the stillness, her words barely above a whisper. "What is this? What does she want from us?" Victor opened his mouth to answer, but found that no words would come. His mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened so far. The forest had been strange from the beginning, sure. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't just a forest, and the woman wasn't just another wanderer lost in the woods. They had stumbled upon something far darker, something older than they could comprehend. The hum of the earth beneath them seemed to grow louder, reverberating in the air, in their bones. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling, a presence pressing down on them. They weren't alone. The forest was alive, but not in the way they understood life. It was aware of them, watching them, waiting for something. It felt almost as though the very air around them was thickening, coiling tighter with each passing moment. Sam moved first, stepping forward despite the unease that gripped him. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "We need to leave before." Before he could finish, the woman turned. Her movements were unervingly fluid, like something not quite human. Her eyes, dark and empty, locked onto Sam, and for a brief moment, Victor saw something in her gaze, a flicker of emotion. Was it pity? Disgust? No, it was something far worse. It was as though Sam's fate had already been sealed. Without a word, the woman gestured for them to follow her again. Her hand swept through the air in a slow, deliberate motion, and despite themselves, the group began to move. They couldn't resist. It was as if something was pulling them along, an invisible force that made every attempt to turn back feel futile. As they walked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in even more tightly, their branches twisting together overhead like fingers locking in a grip. The mist had thickened into a dense fog that clung to their clothes, making the air feel damp and suffocating. The path beneath their feet had become uneven, and yet the woman moved with ease, her steps sure and unhurried. It was then that Victor noticed something strange. The shadows of the trees were no longer just shadows. They were shifting, moving of their own accord, as if alive. The branches seemed to stretch towards them, like reaching hands, and the wind, now howling through the forest, whispered unintelligible words, a language Victor couldn't understand, yet felt as though he should know. His skin prickled with unease, but he couldn't stop walking. None of them could. Finally, they reached a clearing, a small, circular area surrounded by dense trees. At the center of the clearing was a strange altar made of stone. The altar was simple, yet unnerving, with an elaborate, glowing symbol etched into its surface. It radiated a soft, eerie light, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. The symbol seemed to pulse in time with the hum that had been building around them. It was the heartbeat of the forest itself, resonating through the air, through their very souls. The woman stopped at the altar and turned to face them. She didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to crackle with tension. Victor felt his breath catch in his throat. The time had come. The ritual was about to begin. This was no longer a forest of mystery. It was a place of sacrifice, of ancient power, and they were the offering. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear. "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. She stepped aside, revealing something behind the altar, something that made Victor's blood run cold. There, lying on the ground in front of the altar, was a body. Not a human body, but a figure of twisted proportions, half human and half something else. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those eyes, were empty, black voids. It wasn't alive, not in the traditional sense, but there was something disturbing about its presence. It felt wrong, as though it had been placed there, waiting. Victor's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure was bound to the altar, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. The glow of the symbol seemed to pulse in time with the figure's stillness, as if it were drawing energy from the body, from the very essence of whatever lay before them. "This is the sacrifice," the woman said finally, her voice soft but filled with a strange authority. "The forest demands it, and now you are part of it." A wave of realization crashed over Victor. This wasn't just a ritual. It was a test, a choice. They had been brought here not by accident, but by design. They were not the first to stumble upon this place, and they would not be the last. The forest had been waiting for them, and now it had claimed them. The ritual had begun, and there would be no turning back. Victor looked around, but there was nowhere to run. The forest had closed in, the trees now towering like silent sentinels. The clearing had become a cage, the walls of the forest pressing closer and closer. They were trapped, and the woman, the embodiment of the forest's will, was waiting. All they had left was the choice: participate in the ritual or become part of the forest, lost to the endless cycle of sacrifice and rebirth. The air was thick with tension. Every breath felt heavy, as though the forest itself was inhaling and exhaling with them. Each inhalation a reminder that they were no longer in control of their own fate. Victor, Rachel, Sam, and the rest of the group stood in the clearing, staring at the altar and the twisted figure that lay before them. The woman, her face an unreadable mask, waited for their decision. Time felt as though it had slowed to a crawl, the eerie hum of the forest wrapping around them like a straitjacket, squeezing the breath from their lungs. Victor felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the gravity of the choice before them. The ritual was clear now, a sacrificial offering to the forest that demanded payment for the land's ancient power. The twisted body on the altar, the dark, empty eyes, the pulsating symbol, all of it spoke of a cycle older than civilization itself. It was a cycle of blood, of offering, of dark magic that had endured long before they had arrived and would likely continue long after they left. If they left, as the realization settled in, Victor's thoughts raced. He tried to piece together everything that had happened. The strange events that had led them here, the unsettling feeling that had grown stronger with each step they took deeper into the forest. It was as if the very forest had been manipulating their movements, guiding them, drawing them closer to this moment. But what was this moment? Was it fate? Or had they been tricked, led here by something malevolent that reveled in their fear and confusion? Rachel's voice broke the silence again, louder now, tinged with panic. What do you mean? Become part of it? What happens if we don't choose? Do we die? Her eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling in frantic breaths. She looked at Victor as if searching for reassurance, but he had none to offer. He didn't know what would happen. The woman before them, the embodiment of the forest's will, had made it clear. They had to choose, or they would become part of the forest, lost to its endless cycle. The group's fear was palpable now, but Sam was the one who moved first. His face was pale, his body stiff with tension, but he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the altar and the figure. "We can't just stand here. We have to fight back," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. Victor watched Sam, feeling a surge of both admiration and dread. Sam's instinct was to resist, to fight whatever malevolent force lay behind this ritual. It was the response of someone who refused to accept their fate, who clung to the idea of free will in the face of overwhelming darkness. But there was something in the air that made resistance feel futile, like a bug caught in a web, unable to escape no matter how hard it struggled. Victor turned his gaze to the woman, who had yet to move, and felt an odd sensation crawl down his spine. She seemed to be waiting, her eyes locked on Sam as if silently judging him. Was it possible that this was part of the ritual as well? The choice was not just about survival, it was about submission, about surrendering to something far older and more powerful than themselves. The forest itself was not simply an entity of nature. It was a force, a consciousness that had existed long before humans had arrived, and it would persist long after they were gone. To resist it seemed impossible. "Sam, stop," Rachel pleaded, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "We don't know what it will do if we fight. We're trapped. This isn't something we can fight." Her voice cracked, and Victor could see the raw fear in her eyes. It was a fear of the unknown, of surrendering to forces beyond their comprehension. But it was also a fear of losing themselves, of becoming part of this place, this ritual, this cycle of death and rebirth. The woman's voice sliced through the tension like a knife, soft yet piercing. "You do not understand. There is no escaping this. The choice is not whether you live or die. The choice is whether you become a part of this cycle or remain forever lost." Her words lingered in the air, and Victor's skin prickled as the meaning sank in. The cycle, the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth that the forest thrived on. They had stumbled upon something ancient and unknowable, and now it was their turn to become part of it. Victor swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Was there any way out? Any way to defy this? His eyes scanned the altar once again, the stone altar with its pulsating symbol, the twisted body that lay before them. The symbol seemed to shimmer as though alive, as though it were pulling at his very soul. The twisted body, with its dark eyes staring back at them, seemed to mock them, reminding them of the fate that awaited them if they refused the forest's call. Then, a strange thought crept into his mind. What if there was no way out? What if this was not something that could be avoided or escaped? What if the forest had chosen them long before they had arrived, and they were simply too late to turn back? The more he thought about it, the more the idea seemed to make sense. Perhaps there was no way to resist, no way to change the course of events. The forest, with its ancient power, had claimed them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Suddenly, the woman raised her arms, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The air grew colder, and Victor felt a strange pressure building in his chest. The forest was not just watching anymore. It was pulling at them, trying to draw them into its depths. They could feel the pull of the earth beneath them, the pull of the ritual. It was undeniable. Victor took a deep breath and looked at his friends, his companions in this twisted journey. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Sam's jaw was clenched tight, his fists trembling at his sides. They were all caught in the same web, drawn into a ritual they didn't understand, with no way out. He turned back to the woman, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his words carrying the weight of surrender, of resignation. The woman's smile was slow and haunting. "What I want is for you to choose." And in that moment, as the forest seemed to close in around them, Victor realized that the choice wasn't just about life or death. It was about something much darker, about becoming part of the forest, about surrendering to the ancient power that had brought them here. It was a choice no one should ever have to make, but one they had no way of avoiding. The cycle had already begun. The forest had always been a place of mystery and unease for Victor. He had come here with friends, seeking adventure, but now he was standing on the edge of something much darker, something more ancient. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of terror and helplessness that he couldn't shake. The woman, standing before them, had made it clear. The choice was theirs, but what did it mean to choose? In the face of such overwhelming power, such an ancient and cruel force, could they truly make a decision? Or was it already made for them? Rachel's eyes were wild, filled with panic, and Sam's clenched fists revealed his internal battle. But Victor felt something else, an unsettling calm. Perhaps it was resignation, or perhaps it was the pull of the forest itself, seeping into his thoughts and making him question everything he had ever known. Could the forest truly be sentient? Could it truly demand an offering in exchange for life? Or was this all some twisted trick, a game played by an unseen force that reveled in the fear of those caught in its web? Victor took a slow, measured breath. His mind raced, desperately seeking an answer, but every rational thought was drowned by the oppressive silence that had descended upon the clearing. The trees around them stood like silent sentinels, their branches twisting toward the sky, their leaves barely rustling. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the forest, the pulse of something alive and ancient. They weren't just in a forest. They were inside something much larger, something that stretched far beyond their comprehension. He turned to look at Rachel. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she struggled to contain the fear that had overtaken her. She was the last person Victor wanted to see fall to the influence of the forest. She had always been the strong one, the voice of reason in their group. But now she looked as though the very ground beneath her feet had betrayed her. "Victor, what are we supposed to do?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. This isn't real. It can't be. We have to get out of here. We have to fight back." Victor met her gaze, his heart aching. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her they would find a way out, that they could escape this nightmare. But deep down, he knew better. The choice was already made. The forest had chosen them, and now they had to face the consequences. They could try to fight, but what would be the cost? Would it bring only more suffering, more death, as the forest claimed them one by one? Sam was pacing now, his footsteps loud in the silence of the clearing. His voice rose, filled with anger and frustration. "This is insane. We can't just give in to this thing. It's not real. It can't be real. We have to fight it. There's always a way out." But his words felt hollow to Victor. There had been no way out. They had all seen it. How the trees seemed to shift, how the sky above them seemed to warp in ways that defied logic. This wasn't a force they could simply fight, nor was it one that could be reasoned with. Sam's defiance, though brave, seemed naive. They had already seen too much. The forest was not just a place. It was an entity, a consciousness that had been watching them, guiding them here. And now they were part of its story, whether they liked it or not. Victor's gaze drifted back to the altar. The figure on it, twisted and broken, seemed to mock them now. The forest demand had been clear. One life would be offered, a sacrifice to keep the balance of its power intact. But which life? Who would be the one to give themselves to the forest? The question gnawed at him, each second bringing him closer to the realization that their survival was no longer in their hands. The decision was not just a choice to live or die. It was a choice to become a part of the forest itself, to feed its ancient hunger. Sam, Rachel, Victor said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't escape this. The forest, it's already chosen us. All we can do is choose how it ends." Rachel looked at him, her face filled with disbelief. No, we can't just give in. Victor held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Listen to me. We've seen it. The symbols, the way the trees moved, how the forest feels like it's alive. We're trapped. We've been part of its cycle all along." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on them, suffocating them. Sam's pacing slowed, and he stopped, looking back at Victor with a mix of confusion and realization. He had heard the truth in Victor's words, though he wasn't ready to accept it. So, what now? Sam's voice was quieter now, no longer filled with anger. It was the voice of someone who had lost faith in their own will, someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of the choice before them. Victor felt the pull of the forest again, stronger this time. It was no longer a whisper in the back of his mind, but a force, undeniable and relentless. He glanced once more at the woman standing before them, her expression unreadable. She was waiting, patient, as if she knew exactly what would happen next. The ritual had already begun. Rachel's hands were shaking, and Victor saw the tears welling in her eyes. She knew what was coming, just as they all did. The forest would claim them. They could fight all they wanted, but it would be futile. The question now was not whether they would survive, but what kind of survival they would choose. Victor felt his own breath catch in his throat. He was beginning to understand, too. This was not just a ritual. It was a test of who they were, a test of what they valued most. What would they sacrifice to the forest? The answer, he realized, was something that had been with them from the very beginning. Their humanity. "We don't have much time," Victor said, his voice suddenly firm. "We need to decide. What will we become?" The clearing was silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. The trees whispered around them, the ground beneath their feet shifting, pulling them closer to the heart of the forest. Victor closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. The choice had been made long before they had arrived. It was now time to face it. The silence that followed Victor's words was deafening. It settled over them like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. The trees, which moments ago had seemed almost distant, now felt oppressive, their gnarled branches seeming to reach toward the trio. The woman before them, the one who had orchestrated the ritual, stood still as a statue, her eyes like dark pits, pulling them into something deeper. Victor had no doubt that the forest was alive, watching them, waiting for their decision. The question now was not whether they could escape, but whether they could accept the truth that had become inescapable. Rachel's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white with tension. She seemed to be fighting the inevitable, refusing to accept that there was no way out of the forest's grasp. Sam stood beside her, his face grim, the fire of defiance that had burned in him now a dim flicker, overshadowed by the magnitude of what lay before them. The air felt thick, and every breath they took was a labor. This was no ordinary place. They had known that from the beginning. What had seemed like an adventure had slowly morphed into a nightmare from which there was no waking. Victor's heart beat in his chest like a drum. He could feel the pull of the forest deep inside him now, a slow, almost seductive whisper that beckoned him to give in. His gaze drifted toward the altar, where the figure, now even more grotesque and disfigured in the dim light, seemed to mock them. The forest demanded an offering, a sacrifice to maintain the balance of its power, a pact that had likely been struck long ago. And now, they were part of that ancient bargain. The question wasn't if they would offer themselves, it was who would be the one to step forward, to make the ultimate sacrifice. Rachel finally broke the silence, her voice breaking with emotion. "We can't just do this. This isn't real. We can't just give up." She shook her head furiously, the tears streaming down her face. "This is madness. We're better than this. We can find a way out. We have to." Victor looked at her, his heart aching with a pain that was almost physical. He had always admired her strength, her unyielding resolve. But in this moment, In the face of something far beyond their understanding, her defiance felt fragile. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that they would fight their way out. But deep down, he knew it was futile. There was no escaping this place. The forest had already decided their fate. He turned to Sam, who stood silent, his eyes flickering between Rachel and Victor, unsure of what to do or what to believe. There was a strange calm in his eyes now, though it was not the calm of acceptance. It was something darker, something closer to resignation. Sam had been the loudest of them all, the one to question everything, to push back against the unknown. But even he couldn't deny the truth now. They were in the forest's grip, and there was no escape. Victor felt a tightening in his chest as he considered what he had to do. The decision was too much for him to bear. He couldn't be the one to make the sacrifice. But could he ask one of them to do it? Could he, in good conscience, demand that they step forward, knowing what it meant? No. The decision in the end would have to be theirs. The woman who had led them to this moment stepped forward, her presence overpowering. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and the sound of her voice was like a murmur of the wind through the trees. "You are at a crossroads," she said softly, her voice both comforting and terrifying. "The choice is yours. One of you must offer yourself to the forest to ensure its power continues. It is a choice between life and death, a choice that must be made. Who will step forward? Who will save the others?" Victor's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the air, vibrating with an unnatural energy. It was not just a choice of survival, but a test of selflessness, of who among them would give their life to save the rest. The forest didn't care about their fears, their doubts, their desires. It demanded its offering. The question was no longer whether they could escape. It was about who would accept the fate that awaited them all. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her eyes locked onto the woman, her face filled with a mix of fear and anger. "I can't do it," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I can't give myself up." Sam's jaw clenched as he stepped forward. His expression was unreadable. "Neither can I," he said quietly. "But if one of us has to, it should be me." Victor stared at him in disbelief. Sam's willingness to step forward, to be the one to sacrifice himself, shook him to his core. Was this bravery, or was it something else? Was Sam's acceptance of the inevitable a form of cowardice, an attempt to escape the responsibility of making the decision? Or was it the ultimate act of selflessness, a willingness to die for the others, even if they didn't want it? The woman's gaze flicked between them, as though she were studying their every move. Then, she nodded slowly. "The choice is made," she said, almost as if she had expected it all along. "The forest has spoken. It is you, Sam." Victor's heart sank. He wanted to protest, to stop Sam from stepping forward, but the words caught in his throat. Sam was already walking toward the altar, his face set in grim determination. The forest had chosen, and nothing could stop it. This was the price they had to pay for their intrusion into this ancient place. The ground beneath them seemed to shift again, the trees groaning as if the forest itself was breathing in anticipation. Victor's breath caught in his chest as he watched Sam approach the altar. But just as Sam reached it, something unexpected happened. The woman raised her hand, her eyes locking onto Sam's. "Not yet," she whispered, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Sam stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. The tension in the air was palpable. Victor felt his pulse quicken. What was happening? Was the ritual not complete? The woman's voice softened, almost pitying. "The offering is not just about sacrifice. It is about understanding the true cost of what you are giving." She stepped back, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. "And in this case, the cost is far greater than you realize." As her words echoed in the clearing, the air shifted once more. The trees groaned, the ground quaked beneath their feet. Victor's eyes widened in horror as the true nature of the ritual began to unfold before them. The air grew still, a silence so complete that it felt like time had stopped. Sam, who had been ready to offer himself as the forest's sacrifice, now stood frozen, his body taut with confusion and fear. The woman's words reverberated in the clearing. echoing through the trees and pressing against the walls of his mind like a suffocating weight. He had thought that his willingness to give himself up would be enough, that by stepping forward, he would end the nightmare for everyone. But now, as the ritual continued to unravel, it became clear that he had misunderstood everything about this dark place. Victor's heart raced as he watched Sam, trying to make sense of the unfolding events. He had been certain that they had reached the point of no return, that Sam was the chosen one, that the forest had claimed him. But the words from the woman, the priestess of the forest, as they had come to call her, spoke of something far darker. The sacrifice, it seemed, was not as simple as stepping forward and offering one's life. It was more intricate, more malevolent, something that they had yet to fully comprehend. Rachel, standing a few steps behind Victor, felt her breath catch in her throat. The tension in the air was palpable, and she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. They had all been so sure that Sam was the one who had to die, that his willingness would be enough to fulfill the forest's demands. But now, it was clear that the forest had other plans. There was something about this place, something that made the rules different, that played with the very fabric of life and death. The woman, the priestess, stepped closer, her face devoid of emotion. Her eyes, dark and deep, locked onto Sam with an intensity that made him shiver. "You think you understand what it means to sacrifice yourself," she said, her voice low and measured. "But you do not. The forest does not desire your life because you offer it freely. It desires your soul, and that is something none of you are prepared to give." The word struck like a blow to the chest. Sam's mouth went dry, and his body trembled as the implications began to sink in. He had been ready to die, to give his body to the forest as payment for their trespass. But now, he realized it wasn't his life that the forest wanted. It was far more sinister. The soul, the very essence of a person, was the true offering. And Sam, like the others, was unprepared for the cost. Victor felt a surge of panic rising in him, the knowledge of their helplessness crashing down like a tidal wave. They had been so certain, so sure that they could navigate the forest's twisted demands. They had believed that, in the end, they could control the situation. But now, it seemed as if the forest had always been in control. The forest wasn't just a place of darkness. It was a sentient force, an entity that had been manipulating them from the very beginning. Rachel's voice broke the silence. "What does that mean? What does it mean to give our souls?" Her question was raw, filled with fear and desperation. "We've already given so much. What more does it want from us?" The woman's lips curled into something that was almost a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring one. The forest is not a place of mercy. It does not take without giving in return. But what it gives is not what you expect. The price of betrayal, of choosing to walk away, is far greater than you understand. The forest does not just claim life, it claims essence. Once you enter this realm, there is no leaving without paying the price. Sam looked at Victor, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear away from this nightmare, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen, as if the forest itself had reached out and locked him in place. His eyes flickered to Rachel, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of the same terror in her gaze. They were all trapped in the web of this place, unable to escape its grasp. Victor's mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. The forest, it seemed, was a living entity, one that didn't simply kill, it consumed. Their very souls, their identities, their memories, it all became part of the forest once they had entered. And no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they resisted, the forest would eventually claim them. They were not the first to fall into its clutches, and they would not be the last. The woman spoke again, her voice softer this time, but no less chilling. "You think you can betray the forest, that you can walk away without consequence. But once you've made the offering, once you've come this far, there is no undoing it. You're already part of the forest, and when the time comes, when you are called upon again, you will answer. You will give, whether you wish it or not." The weight of her words settled heavily on Victor, Sam, and Rachel. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't just here to survive, to escape, to live. They were here to be claimed, to be consumed, to become part of the forest's dark power. And the forest would not let them go without a cost, one that was greater than death, one that they would never be able to repay. Victor's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he could feel the darkness closing in. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was them, their own souls hanging in the balance. The forest's grip tightened, and he understood that no matter what they did, there was no escape from this place. The forest would always take what it needed, and in the end, it would take everything. Sam's eyes darted around, his mind struggling to process the enormity of the situation. But no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he knew it was too late. The forest had already claimed them. All that remained was the inevitable, waiting for the moment when they would each be called upon to pay the price for their trespass. The silence that had gripped the clearing deepened, thick with the weight of inevitability. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth beneath their feet had stilled in anticipation. Sam, Victor, and Rachel stood frozen, staring at the woman, the priestess, whose eyes gleamed with an unsettling mixture of pity and triumph. Her words had already set the course, making it clear that their fate was sealed. The forest was no longer a mere setting for their trials. It was their master, and they were its subjects. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The world seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning in as if listening intently to their final thoughts. Sam's mind swirled with confusion, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had come here to sacrifice himself, to save the others, but now the reality was far more sinister. He hadn't understood the nature of the forest's demands. He hadn't understood the true price of survival. Victor, standing beside Sam, clenched his fists at his sides, fighting back the urge to scream, to lash out at this woman who had turned their lives into a twisted game. He had always believed in logic, in the power of reason to solve any problem. But here, in this place, reason had no place. There was no negotiating with the forest. It was an entity of will, of power, and once they had entered, they had given up any claim to autonomy. Rachel stood apart from them, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had never been one to fear the unknown, but the sheer magnitude of what was happening was beyond comprehension. It wasn't just the forest that terrified her. It was the realization that the choices they had made had been irrelevant all along. The forest was always going to win, and now it was time for them to pay the final price. The woman's voice broke through the suffocating silence. The forest has claimed what is rightfully its own. You came, trespassed, and in doing so, you offered more than you could ever understand. Now, there is only one thing left to do. The offering must be made. Her eyes swept over each of them, lingering on Sam for a moment too long, as if savoring the finality of the moment. You are part of the forest now. There is no undoing it. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just about death. It was about the essence of who they were, the very fabric of their identities. The forest had consumed them, and now it was ready to extract what remained. He had thought that by offering himself, he would be sparing the others. But now, he understood, the others were never going to be spared. Not from the forest, not from the price of their transgression. Victor looked around, his mind racing for a way out, a way to undo what had been done. But there was no escape, no hope. The priestess had made it clear. The forest would not allow them to walk away. It wasn't just the land, the trees, or the earth that was alive. It was the entire fabric of this place, a web that had ensnared them the moment they had set foot upon it. And now, they were part of it. The forest had claimed them in ways they could not yet comprehend. Rachel's voice trembled as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of surrender. "What will happen to us now?" she asked, her eyes searching the priestess's face for some hint of mercy, of understanding. But there was none. The woman's expression remained cold, distant. She was a part of the forest, and to her, mercy was a foreign concept. "The forest will take what it is owed," she replied simply. What happens to you after that is not for me to decide. But know this, you will live on in its heart. You will never truly leave. The words hung in the air, settling like a heavy fog that clouded their minds. There was no understanding, no comprehension of what this meant. What did it mean to live on in the heart of the forest? What did it mean to be part of something so vast, so ancient, and so consuming? Sam tried to fight the tears that threatened to spill, but they came anyway, hot and unchecked. He had wanted to protect them, but in the end, they were all equally trapped. Victor clenched his jaw, the anger and frustration boiling up inside him. There must be another way. We can't just give up, give in. There has to be something we can do. His voice was raw with desperation, but the priestess's unblinking stare told him all he needed to know. There was no second chance. There was no redemption. They had sealed their fate the moment they entered the forest. Sam, however, felt something stir deep within him, a strange calmness that contrasted with the panic that had consumed him before. There was no escaping this place, no running from the forest's reach. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was something he could still do. I made the choice, he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. I made the choice to come here, to offer myself. But I'm not the only one who's here. We all made that choice. His eyes met those of Victor and Rachel, a silent, understanding passing between them. We all have to face the consequences together. The priestess didn't respond immediately, but when she did, her tone was almost approving. You understand now. The forest does not care for the choices you make. It only cares for the balance. And now, the offering is complete. All that remains is for you to accept your place in the cycle. As she spoke those final words, the forest seemed to shift around them. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows deeper. The air thickened, pressing in on them as the ground beneath their feet began to hum with a low, vibrating energy. They were no longer separate from the forest. They were part of it. The very earth beneath them was alive. And as they stood there, still and unblinking, they could feel their essence being pulled from them, absorbed by the ancient power of the forest. Sam's heart thundered in his chest, and for a moment, he wondered if he would be consumed completely. But as the world around him faded into the inky blackness of the forest, he realized that there was no escape. They were no longer themselves, no longer separate entities. They had become part of the forest, as much a part of it as the trees, the soil, and the shadows that clung to the darkness. In the end, there was no victory, no redemption. There was only the forest, vast and all-encompassing, and the three of them, forever bound to it, their souls entwined in its eternal, suffocating embrace. The offering had been made, and the price had been paid.